Thank you, everyone, for checking out this week's episode of our Smoky Mountain Wrestling Podcast Recap. We appreciate you joining us each and every week, as usual. We are bringing in a special guest this week to the show, someone who has been on our regular show for Booking the Territory that airs every Thursday night at 10 p.m. Central Time. An old friend of the show who, again, has been on twice, and we're bringing him on a third time, except this time it's on our Smoky Mountain show because he's one of the greatest wrestling historians that I know. Got a great mind for the history of wrestling and numerous territories. Say hello to the great Brian Lass again on Booking the Territory. Brian, how's it going, man?
Hey, it's good to be here. I've enjoyed my 2 appearances on the regular Booking the Territory, and now I'm enjoying my appearance here on the irregular Booking the Territory, I guess, as it were.
This has become a very fun thing for Doc and I, and that's why we wanted to bring you on today, because we have Doc has pretty much watched nearly every episode at this point of Smoky Mountain Wrestling. I have not made it through nowhere near as much as him, but we have found it to be a very entertaining territory. You, as a wrestling mind who's watched so many territories, too many for me to count, and know just each and every nugget about those territories, and are true a genius when it comes to it on the 605 Super Podcast. Wanted to bring you on and talk to you about it. Like I said, Doc has watched all of Smoky Mountain. I haven't at this point. How would you best describe Smoky Mountain Wrestling to our fans who are watching Smoky Mountain for the first time? Because we got a lot of people who this is their first exposure to it as they take this journey with us through the episodes that we're going through.
It was Jim Cornette's dream vision when he was looking to leave WCW because he was fed up with Jim Herd and lots of shenanigans. He needed to formulate an idea of what to do next. And on many of those road trips, some of them with Tim Horner in the car, he came up with this idea for this territory. They had several successful shows in East Tennessee, in Knoxville and Johnson City, to the point where Cornette thought there was a real opportunity there if there was another full-time territory. It was an area that had been occupied by John Kazana's wrestling organization, and then Ron Fuller and Southeastern Wrestling, Continental, USA. I mean, various versions of the same company. Ric Flair and Blackjack Mulligan were in there for a cup of coffee in '81. And it was dormant. The last territory had closed up there a few years earlier. So Cornette thought, if everything was in my dream world, what I would do is I'd like to start up a wrestling territory here. And after he left WCW, he had that opportunity. He hooked up with Rick Rubin, the famous producer behind Def Jam, and has produced everything from Johnny Cash to the Red Hot Chili Peppers. And from my hometown of Long Beach, New York, actually Lido Beach, but that's part of Long Beach, he hooked up with him. And Rick Rubin was a fan of this kind of wrestling. He had met Rick Rubin because he was such a big fan of NWA TBS 605 wrestling that he said he wanted to meet 2 people, Ric Flair and Jim Cornette. And they got together and they had a very similar idea of what wrestling should be, how it should be presented. And they made this work. And Jim Cornette, his original idea was to be able to go a little further, not just Eastern Kentucky and Eastern Tennessee and parts of, West Virginia, but he wanted to be able to go to some of the big towns that Jim Crockett had run. He wanted to be able to go to Chattanooga, but there were so many issues with getting TV in those areas because in just a few years, it went from being able to go to a television station and work out a deal to get your show on the air. Worst case scenario, and it really isn't a worst case, you would give them some kind of cut of the local shows that were promoted in that area. And then it became they wanted to be paid between infomercials and other wrestling groups that popped up and were willing to pay for time, which is one of the things Vince McMahon really did in the 80s to take over so many time spots. It was harder and harder to get TV in different areas. So the territory wasn't as big as he had hoped for, but Smoky Mountain Wrestling was Jim Cornette's dream, and it was really a great combination stylistically of Memphis wrestling, which is what he grew up on watching in Louisville, Kentucky, and Mid-Atlantic wrestling, that classic Southern style of wrestling. I guess you could say also Southeastern Championship Wrestling.
Yeah, I find it, you said it, classic Southern style. Doc, you had any follow-ups to what Brian said? Because, man, he's given us some background that I kind of knew but didn't know to that extent.
No, I think it's interesting because one of the things that makes it real, to me, was one of the handicaps, is also one of the things that put it off our radar. Is that the time it came along in that early 90s time frame, TV was changing. It was also the time that, and I think we're all 3 kind of the same age, I kind of stopped watching wrestling because I was too busy wanting to chase ass, and girls don't like wrestling.
Yeah, I mean, I got away from it too, not to the extent that Doc did, but a little bit.
And
No,
this is one of those things that slipped right through the cracks for me that I ended up, you read about, you listen to, and listening to the 605 every week, you hear stories in and around, and it's like, man, I really think I missed something here. And when you go back and you watch it, it's pretty clear if you're a fan of this style of wrestling that there was quite a bit of that 4-year run where they were clicking on quite a few cylinders there.
I was the opposite. I really chased it down because it was at a time, I think their first taping for the demo episode was 91. And by early 92, they were up and running. And the demo may have been early 92, but by the spring of 92, Smoky Mountain was operational and they were running full time. And I had seen something in a magazine, like one of the After Mags, with pictures. It was like a 4-page profile story on Smoky Mountain Wrestling. And I looked in the pictures, and what got me was I saw people that I wanted to see but weren't on WCW and weren't on WWF. I saw Ron Garvin, Paul Orndorff, Jim Cornette, and Stan Lane. I didn't really know Tom Pritchard that well. I knew him from seeing his pictures in the magazine, but he didn't excite me. And it's funny I say that because later on he would end up being, I think, one of the MVPs of Smoky Mountain Wrestling. I saw Bob Caudle, who I thought was amazing. I love Bob. I think Bob Caudle and Jim Ross was Jim Ross's best announcing partner. I think Bob Caudle was tremendous for years and years and years. And again, an established voice from Mid-Atlantic Wrestling and later NWA Wrestling under Jim Crockett. So I saw all these people. I saw the Rock and Roll Express, and I said, wow, it looks like there's something really happening here. And it's not on my TV. I can't watch this. And I want to watch this. And I remember in early 93, and I'm sure we'll get to this, there was a brief time where Jim Cornette was able to work a deal with Bill Watts, who was in his last days of running WCW, so that they did that angle with the Heavenly Bodies and Bobby Eaton and the Rock and Roll Express, and Arn Anderson was on the Smoky Mountain side. And they showed a few clips of Smoky Mountain on WCW TV. They showed clips of the Rock and Roll versus the Heavenly Bodies, and the crowds were hot and it looked cool. And I was like, wow, like this is amazing. And I remember just hoping that there would be some sort of relationship between WCW and Smoky Mountain, and that Smoky Mountain would somehow end up on TBS. I mean, that's just the mad thoughts of a 12-year-old. But
I think you're referring to the Arn Anderson under a sheet angle, where
yes,
they rip off the sheet and Arn Anderson is underneath.
Wouldn't be the first Southern wrestler to be under a sheet.
Right. Yeah, that's the angle where I think Corny shows up and just rips Watts a new asshole on TBS. It was glorious.
Yeah, he did. And it's a funny thing. They did this thing and it was so strong. And in many ways, confrontationally, there were elements of the 1984 Bill Watts, Jim Cornette confrontation on Mid-South Wrestling after the Cornette got his face in the birthday cake thing. It was very similar to that, although, a little bit different too. And it was really great. And by the time it aired on WCW, it had been edited to hell. They edited out all the really good, juicy stuff. And that was because they thought it was they thought he was shooting. He was working an angle, although he did believe what he was saying. But Cornette actually got the unedited version and put that on Smoky Mountain. So that's the only place you got to see the whole thing where, I mean, one of the lines in there that's the most outrageous and amazing is Bill Watts says, "Don't touch me. I don't want to get an AIDS test." Which shows also a lack of understanding about how AIDS is transmitted. But anyway.
Was that before or after he pissed off Hank Aaron?
It was right around the exact same time. I mean, the interview that Bill Watts did about, where he made the controversial comments about race and also homosexuality, lots of things he said in there. That was in 91, I believe. It was in the Pro Wrestling Torch 1991 yearbook. And this was the end of end of 92, early 93. And around that time, Mark Madden had taken that interview and those quotes and sent them to Hank Aaron. And that was kind of the beginning of the end.
Now, Brian, you really dove into Smoky Mountain as you found out about it. To you, who was the most, quote unquote, Smoky Mountain guy, other than Jim Cornette, who obviously he embodies everything that Smoky Mountain Wrestling is and is mostly, like, who from their talent, if you could pinpoint someone that is a Smoky Mountain guy, who would you say hey, that's him? He is what Smoky Mountain's about.
There's a few guys. One I'm going to give isn't an answer I think most people would give, but in terms of behind the scenes, you say Jim Cornette, But it's always important to note Brian Hildebrand, who was referee Mark Curtis, was intimately involved in every aspect of that company. He was working nonstop with a full-time job too. I think he was working at like a Foot Locker or something at that time to just make sure he had enough money to support his working for the wrestling. But he busted his ass and he did everything. So when I think Smoky Mountain Wrestling, I think Jim Cornette and Brian Hildebrand first and foremost. In terms of talent, I think, for me, there's like three guys I would think of. One is Bob Armstrong. And I actually think Bob Armstrong was better in the commissioner role than probably anyone in wrestling history.
That's funny because that's what we're talking about. We're on episode 5 right now. This is going to air on episode 3 of our review, but we love Bob Armstrong. But go ahead.
He's great, but in terms of wrestlers, two people come to mind right away. One is Dr. Tom Pritchard, who I said earlier, who, look, I've been to lots of wrestling shows and I went to lots of Smoky Mountain shows. Tom Pritchard's in my top 5, possibly my top 3 of best wrestlers I've ever seen live, because every night he was great. And he was tremendous in Smoky Mountain Wrestling. And the other one, and really the person who, to me, when I think Smoky Mountain Wrestling, the first guy I think of is Tracy Smothers. And Tracy Smothers was the perfect guy there to be the champion in early 93 and then throughout that year. And he was on top really to the end. And I know Jim Cornette always wanted Brad Armstrong to be there at the beginning and be his champion. And later on in 95, he did eventually push Brad Armstrong to that spot. But I think Tracy Smothers was better for the role, and Tracy Smothers was the epitome of a Smoky Mountain Wrestling wrestler.
I could see that, even though I haven't seen much of it yet. I know, Doc, I'm willing to bet you're in agreement with Brian about that.
Yeah. My number one is Tracy Smothers, and when it really started clicking, and I'm going back through this, and I'm watching it, you're starting to kind of you can see the promotion getting their footing in '92, but they cut this one promo with Tracy Smothers swinging on the back porch or on the porch and the swing, and you just look at it and you go, "That's the guy," And so to me, I absolutely agree that when I think Smoky Mountain, he's got that. He is the wide-eyed Southern boy, and it's just perfect for that time, that area, and what they're trying to do.
And that promo is very important too, because you got to remember in 91, 92, Tracy Smothers went from being in the Wild-Eyed Southern Boys with Steve Armstrong to having a gimmick change. All of a sudden, he was in the Young Pistols.
I've never been to Wyoming or Idaho or wherever.
That's the thing. So these people in the South have been watching him on wrestling, and all of a sudden, this guy who had always been associated with, being the wild-eyed Southern boy was the Young Pistol from Cheyenne, Wyoming or wherever. So when he does that promo, and it's great, and he's not yelling or anything, he's very calm. He's announcing that he's coming there, and it's very down home. It feels very authentic. And to me, the thing that really nails that in is when he goes, I've got nothing against, Wyoming, but I've never even been there. They changed my name. They changed it to that. And it makes it feel real. It makes it feel like, okay, this guy's telling me the truth. And the fans reacted to it. To me, I think Tracy was the most over babyface there, and at times maybe tied with the Rock and Roll Express, but Tracy was major big time over there, and he was great.
The other guy that comes to mind for me is the Dirty White Boy.
Yeah, I think that's a fair thing. He was incredible as a heel. I wasn't as crazy about him as a babyface as I was about him as a heel, because he was so strong as a heel, and he got legitimate heat, like hardcore heat. When he did the gimmick where he announced that he was from New York, and
where he had the Yankees hat on, and oh my, yeah.
Well, the night that he lost the Smoky Mountain title to Tracy Smothers, which was in Pikeville, Kentucky, I believe, in early '93 at the first Bluegrass Brawl. Tracy Smothers was at the gimmick table before the show, because that's what the baby faces did there to really make money. The Rock and Roll Express and Tracy Smothers made a killing just selling pictures and all sorts of hats and anything they can get made up. And he's at the gimmick table, and a couple guys come over to him and they go, "Hey, Tracy, good luck tonight. If you don't get him, we will." And they hand him a business card, and it was the Klan. They were so offended by the Dirty White Boy, announcing on wrestling that he was switching his allegiance and he was now from New York and he's a Yankee, that they were going to get him if Tracy Smothers didn't win the title that night. Luckily, he was scheduled to, and luckily he did. But I've heard conflicting reports through the years, and I remember Tracy telling me years ago he got sick afterwards. He was throwing up. Since then, Jim Cornette said, I don't know about that, but it affected him. I mean, he was worried. What happens if if he slips and breaks his neck in the match? You know, like what happens? But
That's awesome.
yeah, but there was legit heat for White Boy when he announced that he was from New York, and then he was the babyface, and he was still good. But I was just never a big fan of Tony Anthony as a babyface.
They made him.
Yeah, yes. Some people play the better role as heel. I agree with that. Go ahead, Doc.
Well, they made him sympathetic when, especially in the angle with Jake the Snake, where Dirty White Girl takes, Jake DDTs her and makes him sympathetic. But yeah, it seemed like Dirty White Boy sort of lost his footing towards the end when he got paired with Tracy Smothers, because Tracy Smothers was just a force of nature in that role.
Yes, I completely agree.
So let me ask. I'm going to pivot here because you said something about the Klan, and that leads me into a question I have about something that Mike and I have talked about more than any other thing associated with Smoky Mountain Wrestling, and that is the Gangstas.
Yes.
Oh boy. That's all I can say. That promo where Go ahead, Doc. I'm sorry.
Well, yeah. Then what you're talking about is the promo where Corny comes out to offer them a shot, or he'll manage them, and New Jack says, "I got a college degree and a criminal record. I know how to make decisions." I mean, I wonder, based on your last story about the Klan, of how real the disclaimer at the bottom of the screen was about the Gangstas' views are not the views of the station or the promotion. I mean, what was your take on the Gangstas doing that gimmick in that area at that time?
That was very real. It was very real because the NAACP was protesting, and also the networks were getting complaints, and they were a little uneasy with the content. I mean, watch some of those interviews when Bob Caudle was still there. He leaves by like September of '94. Bob Caudle's uncomfortable conducting those interviews because he worked for Jesse Helms. So, I mean, he was uncomfortable with, this whole thing. It was amazing. I was in Knoxville for the Night of Legends in August of '94. And that was the first time I saw the Gangstas. I've been reading about them in the Wrestling Observer, but I was behind on my Smoky Mountain tape, several months behind. So I hadn't seen them yet. I've been reading this guy does incredible interviews. Like, oh, let's see this. He comes in the ring and Jim Ross interviews the Gangstas, and New Jack cut maybe, top 5 greatest promos of all time. It was just
Jim Ross looked legitimately worried.
Yeah, and Jim Ross is someone who's interviewed everyone throughout the years. He probably had never seen a force of nature like New Jack. New Jack is one of the greatest arguments for not scripting wrestlers. He went out there, and all Jim Cornette ever said was, I want you to go out there and piss off white people. That's it. That was the only instruction he had. And he went out there, and he cut these amazing interviews. I mean, that one did have one funny line I remember. It was right around the time Arsenio Hall got canceled, and he goes, "First you silence Medgar Evers, and then you silence Martin Luther King, and now you even silenced Arsenio Hall." And it's just, I remember thinking that was funny. But they were amazing, and they didn't run from the heat. Early on, Cornette's original idea, like a year earlier, let's see, a year, maybe, yeah, I guess it would have been a year because it was '93. He wanted, Tammy Fitch would come in and manage Brian Lee. But the original idea was for Tammy to manage Tony Atlas, who would be a heel, and it would create this dynamic of this, pretty young white girl with this big muscular black guy, thinking it would really get heat. And Tony Atlas ended up not being willing to come in, so it never happened. So a year later, he gets the Gangstas. Jim had seen them working for Sammy Kent in Georgia, who he had been doing some stuff with. New Jack, the only thing of note he had done was in '93, he had a brief run in Memphis with his tag team partner, Mark Freer, the Homeboy. And other than that, that was it. No one really had heard of him. Mustafa Saeed was known as a jobber on TBS. And he brought them in, and man, they got heat. I mean, some of the biggest, I'm trying to think, I know there was one riot, maybe 2. But I mean, the only time, the only time fans got into fights with wrestlers was around the Gangstas. And not the only time, but the biggest controversies were around the Gangstas. And they had heat, but unfortunately it was the wrong kind of heat, because what Cornette thought was people would be willing to pay money to come and see the Rock and Roll Express beat up these scary black guys. In the South, he thought that's what people here will do. Gangsta rap was all over the news. So he thought, I'm going to create my own gangsta rap tag team. And it was actually a really good idea. He was on top of what was happening in culture. I mean, it was a year, 2 years after Dr. Dre put out the Chronic. So I mean, this stuff was really happening.
Yeah,
And
it was timely.
yeah, so he brings in the Gangstas, but unfortunately, the opposite happened. People didn't want to pay money to see them at all because they were black. So it ended up backfiring, and it didn't work out the way he had hoped. But they were incredible. I mean, it was they got real heat. They got real. I mean, there were no other wrestlers in Smoky Mountain Wrestling who regularly walking to the ring had fans get up and yelling in their face, and New Jack would yell back. I was at the taping in '94 where we were smart and he knew it, but he got in all of our faces, and it was intense. But,
I've never met the man, never been in the same room as the man, but to me, watching ECW just a couple of years later, New Jack looks more focused and clear-headed here. I'll kind of leave that gray and blurry on purpose, but he seemed real focused on the task at hand instead of in ECW where it was kind of all over the map with just kind of.
Well, ECW was a different style. It was a different audience, and also I think Jack has said this himself in different interviews. By the time he got into ECW, he was using drugs, and he wasn't really, using cocaine in Smoky Mountain Wrestling. So that obviously affects your clear-headedness. And the other thing is, he goes to ECW, and think about it. He works with Public Enemy, works with, the Bruise Brothers, works with the Eliminators. But in Smoky Mountain, he's working with Rock and Roll Express. And that's the one thing, if you ever hear New Jack interviewed, he always gives credit to the Ricky Mortons for not only working with him, but trying to teach him, like, hey, here's why you do this, here's why you do that. And he was actually trying to wrestle. He was actually trying to learn how to do this. And he didn't need to do that in ECW.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the great things the great little side giggles that I get out of that run with the Gangstas is the first couple of times they come out and hearing Les Thatcher and Bob Caudle both trying to say Gangstas and get it right and sounding like the two whitest men on the face of the earth, which they probably were and still are.
Yeah.
Speaking of the commentating booth, Brian, like, what are your thoughts on, they had a lot of people there. They had Bob Caudle, which I love. I mean, he's still the one commentating on the episodes that I'm watching. They had Dutch, Les Thatcher, JR, Chip Kessler. What are your thoughts on the people in the commentating booth? Did you have ones that you favored any more than others in Smoky Mountain? I personally like Caudle and Dutch right now. I like their chemistry. But I don't know. We just kind of wanted to get your thoughts on the commentary booth in Smoky Mountain throughout the years.
I think Caudle and Dutch are maybe the most underrated commentating team of all time. They were fantastic together. In my eyes, as someone who loved Smoky Mountain to the point where I went down there as a teenager, I think, unfortunately, the shows were never as good after Dutch left in early '94. After he went to Puerto Rico, they were never as good because it didn't have that dynamic. And then eventually Bob Caudle would leave. Towards the end, Bob Caudle was slipping a little bit. He started getting names wrong. He got Jericho and Lance Storm confused regularly, and Steve Skyfire became Steve Skydiver. I mean, there were like mild things like that. But I thought Les Thatcher did a commendable job there. I think he did okay. I wasn't a huge fan of Jim Ross there, but I'm one of these people that don't think Jim Ross was very good after 1993, and I know I'm in the minority here with that. But I think, he was at least a little bit of a step up there. I wasn't a fan of Chip Kessler. Nice guy apparently, but I wasn't a fan of him as a commentator. And like I said, to me, prime Smoky Mountain is Caudle and Dutch together.
Dutch and Caudle are awesome together. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. It's the dynamic of them two calling a match and their banter during the matches. For me, again, I'm at the beginning. I'm in 1992 right now, and it's just wonderful. I just love listening to those two go back and forth during the matches, and it's just great. It's great stuff.
The thing I never thought got enough play was Dutch. I guess in '94 when he went to Puerto Rico. They shoot some angle down on the beach where he's being chased, and it was like a one-time thing, and they never really paid that off. And I thought that there was more there that they could have expounded upon.
That was it. That was like his explanation for leaving. That was just he's being chased. Goodbye. Adios.
So yeah, no, it's funny, man, as you look back on it. It's the one great thing about what we're doing is we walk through them again. We kind of know the history of it, but it's still fun to look back at it from episode 1 through it all and It's amazing right now. Dutch and Bob are the standard bearers, if you ask me, of their team. We skipped a question I did want to ask. You had kind of answered it, but Smoky Mountain worked with WWF, bringing in some huge names. You had mentioned the reason you didn't think everything worked out was just because of the time and circumstance. Why do you think is that why you think it didn't pay off more in your eyes as far as because of the TV dynamics changing? That was the big thing that Smoky Mountain, just those huge names coming in, didn't pay off. It was just because of the visibility via TV.
Well, there's a few answers there. One is the big names did pay off in the sense that they drew houses. When The Undertaker or Randy Savage or Shawn Michaels were there, the houses went up. People paid to see them. I was there for some of those shows. The issue a lot of people have always said throughout the years is it actually hurt the territory because people were now trained to wait for the WWF guy to come in.
Mm.
But in terms of why overall Smoky Mountain didn't, I guess when you say work, succeed the way we would like it to have, you got to remember, too, it starts in 92 and it runs to 95. That is the darkest, worst period for domestic wrestling ever. That is a period where the WWF almost goes out of business and they're at their lowest point after their scandals. That's a period where WCW stopped running house shows because they couldn't draw. Mm-hmm. And that's a period where the only real successful American promotion was Ron Skoller bringing Lucha Libre to cities like Los Angeles and drawing huge houses to an audience that wasn't going to go to these other shows. Smoky Mountain was operational during the worst period of time to be operational for an American wrestling company. And coincidentally, it goes out of business months before the wrestling explosion. And WCW explodes by the summer of 96 with the NWO. And you'd think WCW, look, it was a national promotion and they went everywhere. But, we all think of it as a Southern wrestling company. That's where its headquarters was. That's where its roots was. So you got to think if Smoky Mountain had held on, there's a good chance, if they had been able to financially hold on, that they may have reaped some of the benefits of the wrestling boom that would come a year later.
Boy, you're right. They just missed the boom. They just missed it. Not by much, but they missed it. That's a shame.
There's just something there, and there's just something to me, and I guess being there in person, you have certainly a clearer perspective of this. To me, it's just surreal that Shawn Michaels is in the ring and facing Buddy Landell for the Intercontinental title.
Yeah, I was there that night, and it was a big deal. I mean, and again, the pros and the cons of it. If you look at the cons, they're building up this big event, the biggest in Smoky Mountain history, and it's based around Buddy Landell going for the number 2 belt for the WWF, not for the Smoky Mountain belt, not for even the WWF World Championship, for the WWF Intercontinental Championship. It was a big deal. Undertaker was on that show too. He faced Kane. Excuse me, Unabomb. I said Kane. But I mean, it was a big deal, but it also, again, you start getting to the point where you're waiting for the big guys to come in. And
the thing I thought was interesting about that, and from my perspective, is it looked like Shawn Michaels was at least selling for Buddy. There's a lot of conjecture about Shawn Michaels in the wrestling business, but it looked like Shawn was at least playing ball and being pretty giving to Buddy with some offense and selling and not just taking a night off.
Well, he wasn't a completely obnoxious pillhead in 95. It took a little while before, the Percocets kicked in. And I think he also realized he had a job, and he was on someone else's territory. There's a story that Jim Cornette always tells about when he brought Randy Savage in 94 to go against Bruiser Bedlam in Knoxville. Now, Knoxville had been a main town for the Poffos, for ICW, and before that, when Randy worked for Southeastern, for years. I mean, he had been a regular in that area. He had wrestled there for many years early in his career. And he was coming back, and Jim Ross is thinking, okay, I got Randy Savage. He's a major, WWF superstar, one of the biggest stars in wrestling history, one of the biggest stars of, the generation. How am I going to do this? And Randy goes, I'll put over Bruiser Bedlam. And Cornette was surprised that he was so willing to do business, to put over a guy who, let's face it, before he was Bruiser Bedlam, he was best known as Johnny Canine, a jobber for the World Wrestling Federation. And Randy said, he goes, look, this is your company. He has to come back here next month. I don't. I'm going to do what's right for you guys. And I think in that Shawn Michaels match, I don't know this for sure, but I think that may have been the mentality. he's not there to squash Buddy Landell. Buddy Landell's, one or two in terms of being the top star, single stars for Smoky Mountain Wrestling in the summer of '95, and he's about to have a major babyface turn. He did what was right.
Is that night the same night that he asked you for some pills while Don Marie was sitting in his lap in a pickup truck?
No, that was a considerable time later, and that was in New Jersey, in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, for a Dennis Carluzzo show.
By the way, that story is from the great Brian Last in the 605 Super Podcast, which you can catch every week on Thursdays. One of the best, the best classic wrestling podcast I have ever heard in my life. The stories that Brian tells on there with his co-host and the folks that he brings on as guests are phenomenal. They are things you won't hear anywhere else. I will say that it's great stuff. So that was a great story we're recording this on September 9th. It's going to air on September 25th, 2016. But that is a great story from, I think it was like your September 1st episode, I want to say, where I can't do the voice, but didn't Landell go, Brian, you got any pill?
Yeah, I become friendly with Buddy from 1995 Smoky Mountain Wrestling, and he was a good guy, and it was at that time where, I guess it was one of various times where he found religion and he was trying to clean up and trying to save his marriage. And Buddy was always really cool with me. You always remember the guys who are cool with you, and usually it's the heels for one reason or another. And he comes up for one of Dennis Carluzzo's Eddie Gilbert Memorial shows, and after the show, we're all at the hotel hanging out. I was like 16, and we're hanging out in front, and a pickup truck pulls up, and I just find it so funny that it was the only pickup truck I saw that weekend. You don't really see pickup trucks driving around there. And a pickup truck, I don't even know who the hell was driving it, shows up. And Buddy Landell's in the passenger seat with Dawn Marie on his lap. And this is pre-implants Dawn Marie, pre-ECW Dawn Marie. And he just goes, hey, Brian, you got any pain pills? And I explained to him, I'm a teenager in high school. I don't have any pain pills.
Awesome wrestling stories.
And speaking of being a teenager, one of the questions I have, having listened to your stories on 605 is, what were your impressions of Eastern Tennessee coming from New York as a teenager? Culturally.
Conceptually, I was frightened by it just because I'm a Jewish kid from New York, and all you're told is, they hate Jews. Don't tell them you're Jewish. And, they hate Yankees. And, so you get a little scared, but once you're there, it was beautiful. It was nice. Everyone was cool. I enjoyed being able to sit back, and it gave us a chance to do two things. One, to sit back and watch the way the locals there react to wrestling, which was really cool. And the second was, it gave us a chance to mark out. It was like an excuse to go down there and pretend like it's real and get into it and mark out. And that was one of the things. I wish there was more wrestling out there now that you can actually do that with. But the idea of traveling to a foreign place, and, I know it's not another country, but from Long Beach, New York, it's a foreign place to go to East Tennessee. East Tennessee was cool. Eastern Kentucky was fucking scary. The night we almost got killed in Louisville was scary. But East Tennessee was nice. It was beautiful.
Yeah, that's a good question, though, because you're right. It's like you're a teenager, so it's not like you're an adult traveling there, right? It's a little bit different dynamic.
Yeah, I was 14 when I went down in 94, and I was 15 in 95, so.
Yeah. I think you answered one of our questions. We were going to ask you how Jim Cornette running Smoky Mountain, managing in WWF, how did he find time to sleep? But it sounds like from Hildebrand, he had a lot of help with different things with the promotion. And, I don't know if there's any more you could really add to that, because I could see Jim Cornette getting kind of exhausted, especially during that 4-year run. It would seem like it would take a lot out of him, because he was on, not only was he doing all that, but I mean, he was on TV every week as well. So, I mean, he's got the behind the scenes and front the scenes. Definitely a lot of work on his end, wouldn't you say?
It was. I mean, just the Smoky Mountain stuff alone was enough for him to, pull his hair out. He was dealing with all sorts of stuff all the time. And, eventually a lot of shit blew up where he just had incompetent people working for him, and he had to, deal with all that. And that's where Brian Hildebrand really stepped it up. But, Tim Horner he had to get rid of, and Pam Lawson and all these different people that worked for him that, just it did not work out well. And he had all sorts of issues with them. But luckily, at that time, he was really just doing TV tapings for WWF. He wasn't on the road. He wasn't working in the office. So it wasn't terribly bad. And again, it gave him an opportunity to utilize that relationship where the Heavenly Bodies all of a sudden are on SummerSlam against the Steiners. And think about that. Within I don't know, let's see, 7 months, 8 months? Within 8 months, Smoky Mountain Wrestling and the Heavenly Bodies and Jim Cornette were on WCW and the WWF.
I know.
So I mean, it's pretty incredible, and it gave him a chance to use a lot of guys, to use the Steiner brothers, to use Sensational Sherry, to have the Rock and Roll Express on it was Rock and Roll versus Heavily Bodies at Survivor Series, and the match bombed live because, as Jim Cornette put it classically years ago, the fans weren't there to see the Rock and Roll and the Heavily Bodies; they were there to see the rapping clowns and all the other, cartoon bullshit. But it gave him a lot of opportunities. So I think it opened doors, and I don't know how. I don't think it was that much work. I think Smoky Mountain itself, because Jim, like me, I understand the idea of it, just takes everything on his own shoulders and tries to do everything himself because he could trust himself. And it's hard for him to let go of things and let other people do it, especially when you have people who fail you when they do it. Brian Hildebrand never did, but almost everyone else there gave him a problem at one point or another. But, I don't think the WWF doing those tapings really took that much out of him. If anything, it was like a little vacation for a day or two.
The one thing,
right, because all he had to do was go there, and that was a payday versus at Smoky Mountain where he's running day-to-day stuff and not getting any sleep.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Doc. You were going to say something?
Yeah, the one thing I noticed, having watched these in pretty quick order over a condensed amount of time, is the one thing I do notice, and it's not, it's just I'm making a biological assessment here, is that Cornette put on a ton of weight in that 4-year run.
Oh, yeah.
To where by the end, he has ballooned up, and I'm imagining it's just the stress and eating Wendy's on the road like he talks about and all that kind of catching up with him in his early 30s.
I think the stress was a big part of it. I think, doing all those shows every week and just, when you get out of a show and you have 400 miles to drive, what's open? You go to what the nearest thing that's open is. And, Jim's not the kind of guy who's going to say, can I please have the grilled chicken breast and the side of fruit? He's going to get his cheeseburger and he's going to hit the road. And a lot of the times when he's home and it's late at night and he finally has some time and he has to write the TV, again, he's going to grab a snack. He's going to grab something easy. At that time, he wasn't drinking Sprite Zero. He was drinking just Sprite, like water, and yeah, he definitely gained a lot of weight. I think that was probably his heaviest was, towards the end of Smoky Mountain Wrestling.
Yeah. Yeah. You definitely could see it. I haven't gotten that far, but I've seen clips of those episodes and you definitely can see it. Hey, we had a question, Brian, about the Kevin Sullivan deal when he.
You can call him Kelvin.
The Kevin Sullivan deal when he slices, I can't even
Yukiro
say his name.
Kanemaro's
arm. We want to know because we weren't into the whole tape trader thing. I think I've told you when I had you on the show before. I didn't have a VCR until I was 20 years old. I think it was. I was older. What kind of news did that make in the tape trader industry at that time?
It was a kind of a big thing because, Kevin Sullivan had showed up at the end of 92 and they did the thing where he stabbed Brian Lee. And that was a big thing. And then in early 93, all of a sudden, these guys who had been working for Wing, which was this, it was like FMW, but more grotesque, in Japan, they came over for a Smoky Mountain taping. I think, I could be wrong. I want to say it was Victor Canones who brought them over, but I could be wrong. But someone brought a few guys over for a taping, like Crash the Terminator, who would later be Bill DeMott, Hugh Morris, and maybe Miguel Perez off the top of my head. I got to go back. I haven't thought about it in a while. But Yukiro Kanemaru came over there, and Yukiro Kanemaru, Wing Kanemaru, had a reputation for, doing crazy things and being involved in these crazy things. And I believe he asked Kevin Sullivan to kind of slice him up, and Kevin Sullivan went crazy. And I'm someone who loves wrestling, and that thing's too much for even me to take.
Grotesque. Oh God, I can't. I've seen it, and it's just like, really? Jesus. Yeah.
Did that cause some problems with the local TV at that time?
Not that I'm aware of. No, they censored it on TV.
But the Gangstas did.
But the Gangstas did. The Gangstas did. Stabbing a Japanese man wasn't as offensive as a black man, talking about his criminal record or all that stuff to the South at that time.
Yeah, right. Apparently. Hey, Brian, what was your Smoky Mountain evolved a lot. Doc and I are in our beginning episodes as we're reviewing it. We've been through a few at this point, and the big thing is, Bob Armstrong wrestling. I'm sorry, Bob Collar wrestling the way it used to be and the way you like it. Bob Armstrong levying out fines, $500 for breaking the rules. So it evolved a ton in 4 short years. What was your favorite period? I pointed that out with Cottle and Armstrong because we went from family friendly to some very, very good angles and very good storylines that were not family friendly. But what was your favorite time period of Smoky Mountain Wrestling?
I would say late 92 through the summer of 93 was, to me, just perfect wrestling. It was the best wrestling program in the world at that time. That's when, towards the end of 92, you have Kevin Sullivan show up with the Night Stalker, and Night Stalker had been notorious for having one of the worst matches in the history of the Clash of the Champions in WCW a couple of years earlier with, I think, Sid, where he was managed by Ox Baker, the Night Stalker. He was considered a horrible wrestler, and all of a sudden he was fine in that role as Kevin Sullivan's, demonic second. He was fine. So you have Sullivan there. Ron Garvin is still there. You have the Dirty White Boy trying to kill Tim Horner. The Rock and Roll Express are really picking up, and their feud with the Heavenly Bodies is great. And then you have this other thing thrown in there, which is the stud stable, Robert Fuller and Jimmy Golden. So you get this really great feud between the 3 tag teams, Cornette and the Bodies, the stud stable with Dutch Mantel taking their side. So now you have the heel commentator having someone to really pull for that he's invested in. And then the Rock and Roll Express, and of course they bring in Arn Anderson, the Bodies bring in Bobby Eaton, and it's all that great stuff going on. The rise of Tracy Smothers, the feud with Dirty White Boy, where he, turns into a Yankee, as it were. All that's going on. And then a few months later, Chris Candido shows up. And Chris Candido's, again, one of the best guys in the history of Smoky Mountain Wrestling. And then you have Tammy show up. And a lot can be said about Tammy and the decisions she's made in life and all sorts of things. But she was a revelation as a manager during that time. She was doing, from day one, excellent interviews. She had excellent heat. Jim Cornette always talks about this female fan in Barberville, Kentucky, attacked Tammy and dragged her across the gym floor by her hair. I mean, she had heat, and she was a great manager. You had all that going on. And then, to me, the thing that really is one of the best things in the history of Smoky Mountain Wrestling is Cornette finally is fed up. He's had enough of Bob Armstrong. And he comes out and does one of the best promos of his career, where he just rips apart the Armstrong family, including outing Dixie Dynamite as being Scott Armstrong. And then Dixie Dynamite comes out, takes off the mask and says, yeah, I am. I am Scott Armstrong. I didn't want to get off of my family's name. I wanted to do it on my own. And that, the build up to the Cornette Bob Armstrong feud and that promo were just excellent. So I think there's so much great stuff after that point and good stuff before that point. But from the end of 92, let's say November 92, until that promo, to me, is the peak period of Smoky Mountain Wrestling.
Yeah, you just reinforced what Doc and I have been saying whenever we're recording the review and recaps of each episode is, we're in the beginning now. Hang with us because it gets good and it won't be long. And then you're going to be binge watching it as we have done, or Doc has done all of them. And you will enjoy the ride. It's going to be a fun ride.
Hey, let me ask Doc. Doc, what do you think? What is, in your idea, in your mind, what is the peak period of Smoky Mountain Wrestling?
Mine's a little bit later than that, probably 93 into early mid 94. I'm a little bit more favorable on JR in that time period than you are, although I do agree that his impersonations lately on his podcast are a bit much.
They're terrible. It's just, God.
I really like the Candido coming in angle, and I know that brings in Dennis Corluzzo up north in a couple of angles, which speaks to you, obviously. I like the Gangstas part of it, so that kind of gets it into that 94 range for me. That's kind of that mid 93 to mid 94. To me, is one of my favorites. I watched World Class here in Dallas. In the 82-83 range, right when the Freebirds turned. So that's a magical period, but I almost put that kind of 93-94 with it.
I got to jump in here. You talk about, 94, and you have the Gangstas and everything. And one of my favorite things ever, and I always talk to Cornette about this, maybe the filthiest thing ever said on wrestling. And that's saying a lot because Daryl Van Horn was talking in Carney and saying all sorts of crazy shit. But when Mick Foley was in there, when Cactus Jack came in towards the end of '94, maybe the fall of '94, it was when Chris Candido and Tammy had kidnapped Boots the cat. Yeah, Boots the cat, and Boo Bradley, Balls Mahoney later, was so upset about this, and Cactus Jack on TV goes, "That's not the first time a little pussy has led a man astray." One of the great filthy lines in the history of wrestling.
And it seemed like that was a time period where they were rolling through a lot of names like Mick Foley, and just there was a lot of different good surprises on top of some really, hot angles as well. One of the things I noticed, and we talked about it earlier, was when they brought in Shawn Michaels to fight Landell. When you watch it in retrospect, you know that the end is coming. I mean, obviously, it's not stupid to know that right around Thanksgiving of '95, it kind of comes to an end. It felt like they lost momentum after that kind of summer shows with they had The Undertaker and Unabomb, and then Shawn Michaels and Buddy Landell. And then they started bringing in Gordy comes back, Tommy Rich comes in. Was there a sense in the locker room that they were in trouble, or did they know, or was it did they pull the plug and it was very abrupt at the end?
I don't know how much the locker room knew. I know that no one knew it was the last show until Cornette got there and told everyone it was the last show. He made up his mind over, Thanksgiving Thunder Tour 1995, and then he just announced it at the show. Like, this is the last show. We're closing up. I know for years, some people, I shouldn't say for years, but some people had issue, Brian Hildebrand and Tracy Smothers and a few other people at least wanted the opportunity to try to get an investor in there. Some people thought they had someone to try to keep it going. But, Jim was at that time burned out. Jim had been doing so much and it wasn't paying off. And Rick Rubin was at the point now where he didn't want to keep throwing money into it because it wasn't making money back. And again, this is at the worst point in time for domestic wrestling. Vince McMahon's almost going out of business. How's Smoky Mountain supposed to survive? So,
well, you got to be careful with investors. That's how you end up with a Dixie Carter.
Well, that's true. That's true. Rick Rubin was good though, because other than Prince Karras the Mummy, for the most part, Rick Rubin stayed out of it. He wrote a check and he said, do your thing. Let me sit back and enjoy it.
And that was apparently a good thing, because that was not one of Smoky Mountain's proudest moments. Right?
No, although Darrell Van Horn was a great manager.
Yeah,
he was his promo. I like him better as Darrell Van Horn than as the Sinister Minister or anything else.
I just got through listening to him on Kenny Boland's show for 2 hours, and it was just amazing to listen to those two tell stories. And he seems like an interesting guy in and outside of the ring. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's affirmative.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hey Ryan, one of the questions I did want to ask before we get out of here, because I know we're starting to run long, but in working on the 605 Super Podcast and then, and talking to Jim Cornette on his show, do you have any good Ron Wright stories that you may have tucked away somewhere that we didn't see on TV? And here's a note. I'm close to the very beginning of going through these episodes, and I find Ron Wright to be so highly entertaining. This guy is just amazing. He's the highlight of some of the very first episodes to me. You got any good Ron Wright stories that you can think of, maybe that are off the radar, things that the common fan or average fan just would not know as they're watching Smoky Mountain with us?
Well, I gotta agree with you. Ron Wright in the wheelchair is tremendous. He's just so tremendous. And
it's so gold.
Yeah.
It's gold.
I always thought if I had my own wrestling company, I would hire New Jack for that role. So he could just sit in the wheelchair. Everyone knows he could walk and do promos, and then every now and then interfere. Keep him out of the ring so he doesn't get any more injuries. But just, I thought it would be perfect for New Jack, that same exact role. Ron Wright was great. Ron Wright was one of the biggest legends in the history of East Tennessee, the King of Kingsport, as Jim Cornette later would dub him. Him and Whitey Caldwell had the most legendary feud of all time in East Tennessee. And he was a legend. There's footage you could see of him from, I think, either 71 or 72 off the top of my head. I'm not sure exactly. But there's footage that has been found that I think it came from Joe Kazana, who was the grandson of John Kazana. And it's Ron Wright on Knoxville TV. And he's just insane. He's out there and he's yelling at everyone. Him and the announcer start fighting. He starts yelling at the referee, at the promoter. It's amazing. You should go out of your way to watch it. I always give you a suggestion to watch something, Mike, and usually it takes you like a month to watch it. Watch this.
I've seen the Junkyard Dog angle now.
Okay, watch this.
I'm sorry, I've seen it as an adult since you sent it to me. Let me say that.
You will love this. Ron Wright had so much heat. Bo James, who is the modern day king of Kingsport, when he was on the 605 Superpodcast, he told the story, and it's a well-known story. Ron Wright had a small airplane that he would use to fly to different towns to go to different shows. He had so much heat, the fans burned his airplane. Think about that. And obviously, being a heel in the South, of course he had guns pulled on him and knives pulled on him and all sorts of things like that. But they burned his fucking airplane.
They torched that son of a bitch.
That's heat. Because think about the dedication it takes. Hey, I heard Ron Wright has an airplane. Oh, yeah? Where does he park it? Over by the airport. You know, my dad has some gasoline in his shed. Hey, why don't we get a few of the guys and we go down there and why don't we blow up his fucking plane? Hey, you know what? That's a great idea. Let's do it. I mean, just think about it. It's insane.
Well, for the geography and time period you're talking about, you probably want to replace gasoline with moonshine.
Maybe, possibly. But it's just, that's such dedication from the fans. What a dedicated fan base to blow up the heel's airplane.
That's as Hardbody Harper says on our regular BTT show, that's real classy.
Stay classy, Kingsport.
That's real classy. That's an awesome story, though, man. You're right. That's the thing that goes unseen there. The planning that takes. We're not talking about slashing a tire, or you just walk up to somebody's car and hit it with a little gimmick on the side and you slit the tire. We're talking about you're gonna torch an airplane. You gotta plan pretty well in advance for that. We gotta go get supplies. We gotta get into the airport. There's a lot going on there, so that's awesome. Brian, how you doing on time? We're almost done.
Oh, yeah, I'm okay. Let's keep going.
Okay. Hey, cool. Well, last couple of questions, and then we want to give you some time to talk about what's going on with the Super Podcast lately. But we've gone through a couple of these names, so maybe one sentence as we go through this. What comes to mind in Smoky Mountain when we say, and we've talked about him, New Jack?
One of the greatest promos of a generation, if not of all time. Incredible on the mic. I always found him to be a nice guy. He was always really, really cool with me when I was a kid. Someone who was able to wrestle better than he ever got credit for, as you could see in his matches with the Rock and Roll Express.
I've heard Rod Price has told me some New Jack stories from their ECW days. Nothing bad, but he's told me a few. I mean, he's never said anything bad about him. Although him and One Man Gang, when they were on my show at one point, they said they both said, we just wanted to see sometimes what he could do without all of his gimmicks in the ring. But that was during a different time, and like you said, that was a different period of New Jack. Much later, he had some things going on. Like you said, there may have been some substances involved later on at that point. But anyway, Stan Lane, when we think of him, what do you think related to Smoky Mountain?
Unfortunately, the first thing I think about is his wig, which
hold on. I thought he had a busted eardrum. I thought that's what that was.
Yeah, exactly. Someone actually tweeted me not too long ago, like the before and after, which was like 1 week he was out there with his regular hair, and the next week he had this bouffant hairdo, and he's wearing the wig, and it's so ridiculous. But I mean, it's the last run of Stan Lane. That's it. After that, he's done. Yeah. And that was one of the things that got me hooked on Smoky Mountain, because I loved Jim Cornette and the Midnight Express, and I had seen Jim and Stan on Global because I was on ESPN up here, and I saw them in the magazines doing different things, like for the VWA and for Joel Goodhart and wherever else. It was the last run of Stan Lane, and it was good. I thought Stan was good until the end.
Yeah, very true. Jimmy Del Rey, Smoky Mountain Wrestling.
An incredibly talented guy in the ring who finally got his opportunity, because he had been Jimmy Backlund, a undercard guy for so many years in Florida. Also a complete and utter degenerate who, I think, he made a fool of himself at Brian Hildebrand's funeral. He got fired for some incredibly deviant behavior in the World Wrestling Federation. So, yeah, I guess but in the ring itself, an incredibly talented guy. There's nothing that works better than an incredibly sleazy guy who isn't in particularly great shape, with hair all over him and missing a tooth, being called the gigolo. There's something just hysterical about that. But, in the ring, incredibly talented.
He has one of the most just made me laugh out loud moments in the entire Smoky Mountain run. I forget exactly what it was, but basically somebody knocked either Armstrong or the Rock and Roll Express put Cornette out, and he's sitting in his bed with a neck brace on, and Pritchard and Del Rey are on either side of him in his bed, and there's stuffed animals all around him, and through the whole interview, Jimmy Del Rey is playing with stuffed animals having a fake wrestling match.
I remember that.
This is the greatness of Smoky Mountain. There you go. Terry Gordy in Smoky Mountain.
Oh,
yeah.
Sad. Unfortunate. It's the first word that comes to my mind. I'm a big Terry Gordy fan, as I'm sure both of you are, considering where you guys grew up. He was there at the beginning. He did a couple tapings in between All Japan tours, and it was the Terry Gordy you love, where he hits the ring and runs the ropes and does a great promo and does the power bomb. And unfortunately, he had that overdose in 93, and he was never the same. I don't know if it's officially brain damage, but that's always what's been said. But in early 94, he started doing some stuff. I know that him and Michael and Jimmy Garvin, I think, did some stuff in Dallas. And then Cornette brought him in for the Night of Legends in August of 94, and I was there. And I was sitting with a bunch of other newsletter readers and tape traders and smart fans. And when Freebird hit, and Terry Gordy hit that ring, we went nuts. We were so excited about him. And that's probably the most depressing match I've ever witnessed. And I've been at a few matches where guys were, out of their wits and in bad shape. I've never seen anything that depressing, where everything he was laying in looked really, really weak. Like, weak may not even be the right word. I mean, he was just, the people started booing. The fans there started booing. The fans who believe started booing. And it was very depressing. And that was one of the big takeaways, was just how depressing it was. Apparently a lot of work had to be done to make the promos that he had sent in from Chattanooga from home airable, because he was just somewhat incoherent. By the time he was back full time in 95, he had gotten a lot better. He still wasn't, he was never Terry Gordy again, but he was a lot better. But still, there was an incredible sadness to all of us who had known what an amazing wrestler he had been for over a decade, until 93, to see what he had become. It was very sad.
Yeah, it you could see it whenever he would talk. It was sad. It's funny. I just had James Beard on the show, and we were talking about, he knew Bruiser Brody, he knew Terry Gordy. We were talking about some Bruiser Brody and Terry Gordy stuff, and he said James, I guess, met Gordy in '85 when he got to World Class. James said, "I'll tell you right now, Terry Gordy was the best big man I ever seen." And he's referring to his prime, obviously, not later on, but. So, and everybody, I mean, we don't have to sell people that listen to us, because it's generally a lot of old school fans who could appreciate Terry Gordy in his prime. So, yeah, that was sad about Terry Gordy and Smoky Mountain. It really was, because, we have memories of him from World Class that definitely were not what you're describing.
Yeah, and I agree. I think he probably is the best big man of all time.
Yeah. Terry Funk in Smoky Mountain,
he was great.
Brian.
He was great. I mean, again, this was during that period of the Terry Funk Renaissance, where he had that series with Flair in '89. He was great. And then he retired again, but then he came out. He was doing indie stuff for Joel Goodhart and some other stuff. But then in '94, Terry Funk and Sabu are the two reasons people cared about ECW. And he was the darling of the smart fans, and deserved to be, because he was still great, still good, doing great promos, and still having great matches. In ECW, he was there and he was respected. What was cool about his Smoky Mountain run was he got to be the heel Terry Funk. He got to be the crazy, middle-aged and crazy heel. And he did great promos. I remember I was down there. It was like the day before the Knoxville show in '94, where we were watching the TV. And he just did this promo where he starts the big promo begins and he's like, Brad, Bob, Steve, Bruce, Carl. And he just keeps going through the names. He goes, I don't know how many legitimate and illegitimate Armstrongs there are. Just this incredible interview. And I got to see him down there. He was great. Smoky Mountain is also the first place he did a moonsault against Bob Armstrong. So think about that. Terry Funk was, if he wasn't 50, he was closing in on 50, and Bob Armstrong was in his 50s. And in that match, Terry Funk did a moonsault onto Bob Armstrong. So, I mean, just insane. I mean, it was the era, too, where that was the big thing, everyone doing moonsaults. All of a sudden, Vader whipped out a moonsault, and Terry Funk whips out a moonsault. And next thing you know, everyone's doing moonsaults.
Yeah, you did. It got to that point. It really
the only
did.
thing crazier than Terry Funk's like I'm coming into the territory to fight the Armstrongs promos were, because I always felt like he smoked a big fat bowl right before he did them, those interviews and promos, was Dick Murdoch shooting them in the snow, shirtless, drinking beer.
Yeah, that was good stuff. And again, that's the last really good Dick Murdoch stuff.
Yeah. Wow, man. See, as we go through it, this is the point we're making with Smoky Mountain. I mean, we're going through these names, and you'd sit there and think, oh, do I really want to give this Smoky Mountain thing a chance? I'm telling you, I keep telling our listeners, man, listen to it. Go watch it on YouTube. It's freaking amazing. As I say that, the next person, Buddy Landell, to you, Brian Last, in Smoky Mountain.
Buddy had his last great run, and I think maybe one of the best things he ever did in 95. 95, he got into shape because Buddy had gotten really out of shape and he had all of his issues with drugs. And all of a sudden he got into really good shape and he was really good there. And all of the people who loved Buddy Landell, who thought like, oh, I wish the Buddy in Mid-South had been, the Buddy all these years. He was great in Mid-South. Then he went to the NWA. He was still really good. And then he got fired there and he went to Memphis in 86 and he did stuff with Bill Dundee. And after that, he was still good and people liked him, but he wasn't that Buddy Landell anymore. All of a sudden, he had this renaissance in early 95. He got into shape. He was clean, or at least relatively clean. And then he turns babyface. And that promo right before the Shawn Michaels match, is one of the strongest promos of that era, where Cornette saying he's going to interfere in the match and do whatever it takes to get Buddy to win, and Buddy says you won't. And then he turns to the camera and it zooms in on his face and he talks about how his life had spiraled out of control due to drugs and alcohol, and how he wasn't from California. He was from Knoxville, and he was going to win this title in front of his hometown fans, and he's going to do it himself. It's amazing. It's great stuff.
Yeah, but Buddy, I'm not gonna sit there and say I was a big time Buddy Landell fan, but man, his time in Smoky Mountain, man, you can see that there was something there with Buddy. You can see that there was definitely something there, and I'm glad he got to show what he could do in Smoky Mountain. Dirty White Boy.
Dirty White Boy was, I think, the strongest heel they ever had. Obviously, still a big star there as a babyface. Had the feud with Jake, had the feud with Bruiser Bedlam, eventually teaming with Tracy as the Thugs. And it's still, again, that's another guy who was a big star in the South, did great stuff in Memphis, did great stuff in Continental, and then Smoky Mountain's the last thing of any note. I mean, he did the plumber gimmick in WWF, but no one wants to remember that. Yeah. Fantastic promo, was able to really fire up and make you believe in him. And, I wish, that's the sad thing. It's just, I wish his career hadn't ended for all intents and purposes with Smoky Mountain Wrestling.
Yeah. I could agree. And Tracy Smothers, last one when Smoky Mountain
day in and day out, maybe the most valuable player for Smoky Mountain Wrestling. Always worked hard, had great matches, good promos, eventually great promos, really over with the fans. He was the way a babyface would be. They brought Lance Storm and Chris Jericho down there, and the problem was Lance Storm would stand at the gimmick table with his wife and act like he didn't really want to talk to any of these fans. Tracy understood the way it worked. You bring your gimmicks, you schmooze all the fans, you take pictures, you shake hands, you smile, you flirt. And that's the way a successful babyface works in a territory. And Tracy did it better than anyone, maybe. I mean, him and Rock and Roll, like I said, 1 and 2, just standing at their gimmick table and working the room without moving. It was really something to see. Tracy, again, great matches. Think of it. I mean, he got good matches out of Brian Lee, which is an accomplishment. His stuff with Dirty White Boy was really good. His stuff with Candido was excellent. And the latter matches with Candido are underrated. No one talks about them. And a lot of that's because the Shawn Michaels Razor Ramon WrestleMania 10 ladder match happened at the exact same time that the ladder matches with Candido and Tracy Smothers were happening. So they kind of got lost in the shuffle. And just great. I mean, I saw so many great Tracy Smothers matches. And like I said early on in this, I think when I think Smoky Mountain Wrestling, he's the first wrestler I think of.
Yeah. Oh, what a great promotion. Other than geography, were Smoky Mountain and ECW all that different to you?
Yeah.
Because we've made some comparisons of the two, but I'll let you weigh in on your thoughts.
Completely different. One is trying to run like a traditional wrestling company, where the fans believe and you present the product to them under that pretense. ECW was very, very different. And again, early ECW, if we're talking about the run of Smoky Mountain Wrestling, the first year and a half of Smoky Mountain Wrestling was ECW under Eddie Gilbert, and ECW, when it was first establishing itself before Eddie Gilbert, that was different because Eddie was up there trying to be Jerry Lawler. He was the king of Philadelphia. So there was an element of Southern style wrestling, but the commentating wasn't as good, and the roster wasn't as good. It was a lot of the typical Philadelphia guys who had been around for a while, Johnny Hotbody, Tony Stetson, guys like that. But then Paul comes in and it's totally different because Paul's trying to present this new wave of wrestling television with music that he never paid for the rights to use. He's, Salt and Pepper and all these things are on ECW TV. And he's very much trying to present a new product, a product that more than Smoky Mountain catered to the smart fan and the tape trader. I think a great example of the differences is Sabu. Sabu never worked for Smoky Mountain Wrestling. Sabu got over big time in 93. And I think one of the sad things is people today don't truly appreciate how big he was from 93 to 95, how influential he was. And look, everyone stole the tables from Sabu. People had gone through tables before, but everyone stole the tables from Sabu. All of a sudden, Public Enemy were doing tables and the Dudleys were doing tables. Mm-hmm. Sabu started that shit. And Sabu was a sensation in the newsletters and on the indie scene. And he was working for ECW and having these great matches and going through tables and putting himself through tables, not people throwing him through tables. He would have a match, and then after the match, moonsault a table until it broke. So he was doing shit like that. And I remember Jim Cornette saying, and to me, this exemplifies the difference. He goes, I mean, if I had Sabu, I can't have him doing that. It wouldn't make sense to people. I would have to have someone put him through the table. I can't have him doing it to himself. And to me, that's a big part of the difference there is it was different audiences, and you're presenting a different product to different audiences. If Jim Cornette was presenting a product to the Philadelphia audience, I'm sure it would be different. And if Paul Heyman was presenting a product to the East Tennessee audience, I'm sure it would be different.
That's an interesting perspective on it. I think when Doc and I were asking that, we had noticed that as Smoky Mountain got rolling, to me there was a level, I don't want to call it a level of violence, but there were some things that we felt were kind of common. And Doc, you've watched more of it than me.
The one thing
but
that comes to mind is the Moondogs hitting those guys with stop signs.
Right, but you see, that's not ECW. That's the Moondogs. Moondogs were doing that in Memphis before ECW existed. And quite frankly, Southern style wrestling was doing that. I mean, the concession stand brawl was invented in Memphis. And that's something Jim Cornette saw growing up. That's something that when Todd Gordon hired Eddie Gilbert, it was because he wanted Memphis style wrestling. And
Yep. Dutch said that actually recently on not the one that you guys did this week, but there was it was Wade Keller's live cast that he does. Dutch had mentioned that they were talking about ECW, and Dutch had ran into some ECW fan, and he was like, "Yeah, you think this is so special? We did this in Memphis, 20 years ago." They were talking about some angle that they were doing and how the matches were violent. He goes, "Well, you just described Memphis to me just now."
The difference was Memphis, there was heat. Memphis, I mean, there's nothing better than when a wrestler hits another wrestler and the whole crowd at the same time goes, "Woo!" Makes that noise with each blow. And you never saw that in ECW, but you saw that in Memphis.
Yeah. That was funny. That was kind of where that question stemmed from, not from us saying that they were the same, but I guess similarities and
Hey
differences.
Mike,
So,
hold on.
Doc, did I
I got
miss
one
anything?
question that we haven't talked about, and you mentioned his name, and I was just wondering is Smoky Mountain was the last time Eddie Gilbert was on TV here in America,
Yeah.
and he brought in Kane or Unabomb. He had a weird, to me it seemed like he was acting weird and paranoid, and was that some sort of inside allusion to how do you think how he was kind of where he was personally, or was that just agreed upon he would act that way, part of the script?
Something that's actually been talked about a good deal. First of all, he didn't bring Unabomber in. I mean, I know on camera he did, but Dutch Mantell was in Puerto Rico and told Jim Cornette, "You got to hire this kid."
Right.
And that's where Unabomber came from, because Glenn Jacobs had been working in Puerto Rico. Jim had connected with Eddie again at the NWA title tournament in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, November 19th, 1994, that Dennis Carluzzo promoted. And Corny realized Eddie's sitting at home not doing anything. He's not working for ECW because him and Paul Heyman had this falling out and he got pushed out of his job. He's not working for Memphis because, at one point or another, Eddie had heat there. He's not doing anything. Eddie's a great mind. Let's bring him in. He was also wary of Eddie because Eddie had gained a reputation for booking his own shit and doing his own angles and not telling the office he was going to do something and doing something. But he had known Eddie since they were kids. They knew each other before they were in the business, when they were going to the WFIA convention. And Eddie was the son of a wrestler and Corny was just some photographer from Kentucky. So they knew each other for years. And he brought him in. I think it is my personal belief that you're seeing real life Eddie Gilbert a lot in that, because Eddie was someone who, by all accounts, I can't pretend I knew him. I met him once and he was nice to me. But by all accounts, you talk to people who did know him and were around him. Eddie had issues with some paranoia around that time, and he was a little manic around that time. And that's what you see. It's very different than any other version of Eddie Gilbert that you ever saw anywhere.
And it's creepy because 3 weeks to 4 weeks later, he's dead.
I mean, he did one taping. So he did one taping. He's on 4 episodes, and then he never showed up again. And he's dead a short time later. And it's incredibly sad. He died on the same day as Kerry Von Erich, 2 years apart. And I will say one thing on the bright side, not that it's really a bright side. I sound like Jimmy Hart now, but behind every dark cloud, there's a silver lining. And today is the greatest day of my life. No. Eddie leaving led to Al Snow coming in. And the best work Al Snow ever did in his career was in Smoky Mountain Wrestling.
I would agree with that.
Yeah. Man. A magical territory, and that's why we're taking all of our listeners down the road to Smoky Mountain.
So now that we've had you on for an hour,
a lot of
now
fun.
that we've had you on for an hour and 20 minutes, tell us everything you know about Dr. Mike Lano.
I need a full 4-hour show to touch the surface on that topic.
He would need us to do our best 605 imitation, which we could never do because it's such a great show to be able to cover all of that with Dr. Mike Lano.
We're making him a star. I think I'm going to have to do T-shirts pretty soon. Like, I'm a Mike Lano guy. With a picture of like a little drill for the dentist.
Make sure the Denim Fritz one comes first, because I will buy one. Let me promise you that.
I did recently look into the price for producing a denim shirt, and I don't think I'm going to be able to do that, so it would have to be just a T-shirt. But I did look into it.
Denim Fritz is so awesome. That dude is great. His tweets are the best. Dear God, dear God. Brian, tell us now again, this is gonna air. I'm gonna have to do some editing on the show that's already been produced for our September 18th, 2016 show, because it's gonna air on that one. So I'm gonna have to do some editing to the one it's not out there yet, but I'd already built it. But this is going to air on the 18th. The reason I say that, I want you to tell us what is going on with the 605 Super Podcast, keeping in mind that this is going to air on September the 18th, 2016.
How the fuck should I know?
I know. No, what I meant was tell us in retro what you've got. Yeah, this week. And then, the great thing about your show, if I can steal this proceeding from you as you plug it, is it's timeless, meaning that you could literally go back to episode 1 and, you're not talking about current events. So it still rings the same as if you were talking about it, 6 months ago or today. It's going to be the same thing. So yeah, go ahead and tell us. I know you've had Jim Cornette on as of recent, and just some really really good shows. So go ahead and plug everything with the
Well, thanks,
605.
Mike. And that is to me the most flattering thing is when someone says, "Hey, I just discovered your show, and I went back and I listened to every single episode to find out what's going on." And that is one of the things I intended to do early on, was make it so that you can listen to it at any time. It's not like we're going over, and this week on Raw, this dumb shit did this thing to this other guy, and then it was a commercial, and we don't do any of that. So we talk about classic wrestling.
Hey, we do, and it's not that much fun. So
Yeah.
you're on the right path.
But that's the thing, you got to have fun. As my friend Scott Cornette, who was co-hosting a few times recently, said, people who don't like wrestling, what do they laugh about all day? So you got to have fun with it, and that's what we do on the Super Podcast. It is at 605pod.com. It's on iTunes, Stitcher. Sometimes Stitcher's a motherfucker. Lately they've been giving me some kind of problem where the show doesn't go up on time and then it pops up. But either way, we're all over the fucking place. Anywhere you look for it, the show is there, the Super Podcast, and of course on Facebook, facebook.com/Super Podcast, the wildest wrestling community for any podcast out there by far. We talk classic wrestling. We talk fringe wrestling. We talk cult favorites. We have interviews each and every week. We have different guest hosts each week. Jim Cornette was the guest host. Let's see if this is going to air the 18th, like Mike said. 2 weeks ago, or a week and a half ago, Jim Cornette was the co-host, and we had a fun talk about everything from Capital Combat 90, the return of RoboCop, to Sue the Shooter's Confessions of a Ring Rat story, which is just insane. Plus, I had an interview with Peter Burkholz about Houston wrestling. Peter was the longtime commentator and promoter in Houston, the nephew of Paul Bosch. So we talk all about the history of Houston wrestling from the Great Depression on through the Junkyard Dog and Bill Watts, and later Vince McMahon. So there's all that. A couple weeks ago, everyone's gone crazy about the episode Tom Robinson co-hosted, talking about his confrontation with Ric Flair recently in a hotel bar.
That was awesome.
Thank you. In unison, people say that is awesome. Totally awesome if you were listening to the show.
Totally awesome.
But yeah, that's been very, very popular. Tom's going to be back on soon. Scott Cornish is going to be back on soon. Hopefully Kurt Brown. I've had an amazing guest hosts, and I have more people lined up. More interviews, more segments, more comedic bits lined up coming soon. So please give us a chance. And for those of you who are a bit intimidated by the time, because this is a show as opposed to a podcast. It's the Super Podcast. In my eyes, this is the radio show you'd be listening to on your commute on the wrestling radio network that doesn't actually exist. That's the way I try to make this show. And if you're intimidated at all by the time, you can go to each show post at 605pod.com or on the Facebook page. And there are timestamps. It'll show you the interview starts here, the top 10 starts here, this is here. So that should help you get through it. And once you do, you'll probably get hooked and listen to the whole thing. So again, the 605 Super Podcast, 605pod.com, and facebook.com/Super Podcast. We're on iTunes, and we have t-shirts. So buy them.
It's a great show. Doc, you wanted to tell Brian something before we left today about Your Mama the Jungle Savage.
Mike won't admit this because he's
no, this is you.
But the thing is that we both agreed and talked about that the first time we heard, because it's a 4-hour show, so sometimes I'm doing stuff around the house and I hear things and I'm like, I got to run that back and see what I just heard. And the first time I heard Yo Mamba the Jungle Savage, I thought it was Dusty messing up Kamala the Ugandan Savage.
That's funny.
And so did Mike. He won't admit it.
What it was the voice caught me when I heard Yo Mamba. I just heard Dusty, that lisp. I don't know what it was. That's what I heard. So anyway, yes, I kind of admit to it, but you admit to it.
And I am the guy that you're talking about right now. I mean, I've listened to, I think I got into the 605 podcast around episode 20 or early 20s, but I am on, so I listen to one each week, the new one, and I'm on episode 13 going back and finding out about Hangman Bruce Pobans and other stuff and the origin of these great stories.
Yeah, well, thank you. I appreciate it. And that's the thing. People listen and they hear, who's Sue the Shooter? Who's the Hangman? Who are all these crazy characters? Who's Santo Gold? And then you go back and listen to it. And once you're in on the joke, it just gets better and better and better.
The movie that,
especially Sue the Shooter.
The movie that must be made is the Chris Colt story, though.
You're the second person to say that to me this week. And yeah, I have some more stuff planned for the show on Chris Colt. you know, it's hard because here's a guy who there isn't a terrible amount of footage of, and there aren't a lot of people around who really knew him well. So it's hard to try to build out segments about him, but I've got a few people I'm ready to go with, and I think we're going to be able to have some more stuff about Chris Colpott. Easily one of the most fascinating guys in wrestling history, and anyone who worked with him or saw him will tell you one of the best workers that never really got the opportunity that someone at his caliber, should have received.
Wow. Good stuff, man. Well, Brian, as always, I very much appreciate your time. Thank you for coming on our new show, Smoky Mountain Wrestling Podcast, because it is what we love, and it has now become Doc and I's favorite territory. Even though we grew up watching World Class in Mid South, it's just a spectacular territory. Listen, if you're listening to this, come along for the ride with us, please. Go enjoy it. It's going to be a fun ride. We got a few more years to go as we're just kicking it off. But Brian Lass gave us some of his time to tell us all about his expertise on the territory. So Brian, thank you again, man. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me here. Tally ho!